The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Wednesday, February 19th, 2020. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape. Steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, we're on vacation. And as I look back on my past, I realize I had a cold today when I recorded this. And hopefully by now I'm over it as you hear the sound of my voice. But just because we're on vacation doesn't mean that the show is. The show is not, in fact. In fact, we have all new, brand new content for you. Well, mostly all brand new. Some content you've never heard before, and then other that is totally brand new. On the program today, we will be talking to Professor Stuart Schrader, author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. Fascinating story of how things like 911 was originally developed to capture communists in Venezuela. That dynamic is, it's nuts. The other thing that we will have for you today is an interview I did with Andrew Romanoff. He is the progressive running against Hickenlooper, right? Is it Hickenlooper? Yeah, he's running against Hickenlooper in Colorado to defeat Cory Gardner. Cory Gardner is in deep, deep doo-doo, as it were. Donald Trump, I think, is 18 points underwater in Colorado. And Cory Gardner voted with him on just about everything, particularly the impeachment. He will also end up voting for Medicaid cuts, more or less. So there's a real pickup opportunity there, and we want a progressive. We don't need to have a Senate full of Joe Liebermans on the Democratic side, and that is what we're going to get with Hickenlooper. So check out this interview. Now, the Romanoff interview is one I did for Ring of Fire Radio. It's in 2 parts. Maybe if you've listened to the past couple of shows, you'll notice that. But and then we will get into the Badges Without Borders. Today, Wednesday, there is a Democratic debate in Nevada, if I am not mistaken. That's correct. It's today. I am going to attempt to live stream it on our YouTube channel, and I might be able to put it out on audio. I'm not sure. This is going to be a technical feat, and also I'm going to be juggling my kids at the same time. Not literally. That would be huge on YouTube. That would be a viral hit. But my daughter, my 14-year-old's too big to try and juggle, and frankly, the 7-year-old is too, probably. So check out our YouTube channel at samcedar.com/YouTube for the live, and I may try and put it up in the members feed on our app. Maybe I think I could do the free one, too, on the app. We'll see after the fact. It may be tricky. I'm going to try, though. So sit back, enjoy this interview with Andrew Romanoff. These folks need our support, folks. We need not just to take the Senate, we need to take it with progressives, or as many as we can. And then listen to this fascinating story of how our attempts at global counterinsurgency. We sent cops abroad to fight communists. They came back and changed our policing in this country. All right, quick break. Right back. Don't forget, you can support this show by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. All right, back in a sec.
So, Andrew, let's just get to the nuts and bolts of it. Let's start with why you're running. Your race, obviously, a primary but then hopefully to face Cory Gardner. Yours, Colorado is, if the Democrats are going to take the Senate, Colorado is going to be one of the first, or it has to be one of the first seats that they take in this effort. So just give us a sense of why you're running, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, you're right. There is no path to a Democratic majority in the Senate that doesn't run through Colorado. Cory's considered one of the, if not the most vulnerable Republicans in the Senate. And I'm running because I'm not content to stand by while more people in the richest nation on the face of the earth struggle or suffer or die on account of problems we can fix. We need a senator who will treat the climate crisis like the emergency it is and end our reliance on fossil fuels. We need somebody who has battled the insurance industry, as I've done for the last 4 years as the president of a mental health organization, and we'll make sure we get a plan of comprehensive coverage for all Americans that doesn't depend on their job or the whims of an insurance company. We need to build an economy that works for everyone. We need to end this epidemic of gun violence, and we need to reform our broken immigration system. And on every single one of those issues, Cory Gardner is part of the problem.
Okay, and so give us a sense. Now, you're running in a primary, and so the first order of business is going to be to get the Democratic nomination. Why you?
Well, I've got the strongest record of legislative leadership in this race and was recognized as one of the most effective legislative leaders in America. I led the Democrats here in Colorado to our first majority in 30 years, our first back-to-back majorities since the 1960s. I have earned endorsements now from nearly 350 state and local officials across Colorado, 10 times as many endorsements as all the other candidates combined. And frankly, I'm not the darling of Washington. I think that's an advantage. Coloradans want to know that you're willing to stand up to your own party when your conscience or your constituents demand it, just like Cory Gardner promised and failed to do. And the truth is the national party isn't always right. We've seen and learned the hard way what happens when you allow corporate cash to contaminate both political parties in Washington. It's one of the reasons we haven't gotten the aggressive climate action we need. One of the reasons I'm running on a platform that includes a Green New Deal. One of the reasons I've earned the endorsement of the Sunrise Movement, among other environmental activists.
I take it in terms of the priorities of Coloradans. Obviously, the environment is up there. How does that play into this primary?
It's a real point of division in this race, not just between Cory Gardner and me, but also between our former governor. John Hickenlooper, as you may know, got recruited into this race by Chuck Schumer and the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, even though Hick said he didn't want the job and wouldn't be good at it. I happen to believe him. And he has acquired a record that is not consistent with the kind of aggressive climate action we need. In fact, he sued communities in Colorado that tried to restrict fracking and protect their public health. He literally drank the fracking fluid. He refused to sign the No Fossil Fuel Money pledge that I've signed. He not only opposes the Green New Deal, he describes progressive priorities like that as, and these are his words, the discredited ideas of Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin. I expected we'd have to fight Republicans like Cory Gardner. I didn't realize we'd have to fight Democrats who are parroting their talking points.
I mean, I guess, obviously I'm not from Colorado. I guess the perspectives of Coloradans probably different from mine, but as a progressive, and I look at a guy like Hickenlooper, who is, like you say, the darling of Chuck Schumer and some in the wing, I would say probably the more corporatist wing of the Democratic Party in some respects. I guess my concern, and I want to get your take on this, is that when a guy like Hickenlooper gets the backing of the infrastructure of the Democrats in the Senate, he's going to want the opportunity. There's going to be gives and gets back and forth, and I know that there isn't sort of like a broad acceptance of a very aggressive climate change program across the Democrats. Where does that come in? I mean, when they start to horse trade like that, I mean, you've been in a legislature, you have an understanding of these dynamics. Where does Coloradans end on that exchange?
Well, Coloradans end up holding the bag. There's a report out just recently that shows we have some of the worst air pollution in the country. It's in large part the product of the runaway oil and gas production and consumption that Governor Hickenlooper presided over. And you're right, this aggressive approach that we're taking to the climate emergency. And in fact, we put a very provocative ad on our website at andrewromanoff.com if you want to see the stakes. That doesn't sit well with the Schumer crowd or their corporate benefactors. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist, right, Sam? I mean, you can follow the money and figure out pretty quickly why we haven't taken the climate action we need or made the kind of health care reforms that we need. It's in large part because the lawmakers who are supposed to be regulating those industries instead are subsidized by them. It's all pay to play, and we're paying the price.
I mean, one of the things that we saw when the Democrats took over the House was Nancy Pelosi immediately trying to shut down this notion of a Green New Deal. And if the Democrats get the Senate back, what's the opportunity? How does that change the pressure on the House to start to accept that if we have enough, frankly, senators like yourself who are prioritizing something like this?
Well, you hit the nail on the head there, Sam, right? It's not enough just to take a majority, although that's key, to hold the House, to flip the Senate, to take the White House. I would argue also to kill the filibuster, which is blocking progress on a lot of these fronts. But we got to make sure that we elect Democrats who bring the courage of our convictions to Washington. And frankly, I take a lot of inspiration from the young folks who are leading this charge. For example, the Sunrise Movement, which, as I mentioned, has endorsed my campaign, has done more to address this climate crisis than most of the adults were paying in Washington. I turned to one of the young people who was leading this charge, and I expressed my admiration. And he turned to me and he said, well, no kidding, Grandpa. He didn't actually say Grandpa. That was just the sentiment. He said, we're going to be here a lot longer than you are. And I think young people understand that. And it's one of the reasons that we need them to put pressure on the folks in Washington, because this change is not going to come from D.C. on its own.
I want to start talking a little bit about what's happening with Cory Gardner, but you brought up the filibuster, and I think there are senators who in many respects, they try and position themselves in the middle of the Senate as a way of making them the power brokers, where they are representing their own interests for power. I mean, this has just been my observation over the years. They represent themselves and try and put themselves, and if that means thwarting a Democratic majority, they will do that to be the guy that controls the power. And there's several candidates for who those people are going to be in the Senate as they are now. Getting rid of the filibuster strengthens the hand, obviously, of the Democrats because it means that they need less of these people on board. Where do you see, what other reforms do you think needs to happen with the Senate? Are you worried about getting rid of the filibuster?
No, and I'll tell you why. I led the House of Representatives in Colorado for 4 years. I was the Speaker of the House here. We don't have a filibuster in the State House or the State Senate. We take up or down votes on bills. One of the reforms, to answer your question, that I would support would be the one that Colorado adopted years ago that says you can't allow the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader or President of the Senate to just pocket bills that he or she doesn't like. Every bill in Colorado gets a hearing or a vote. The same should be true in the U.S. Senate. Instead of allowing Mitch McConnell to act like a tyrant, he calls himself the Grim Reaper of the Senate and takes it as a compliment. Another reform I'd support, Colorado has passed a sunshine law that says any meeting between two or more lawmakers on an issue of public policy has to be open to the public and the press. So you can't cobble together these backroom deals in the dark of night where nobody is around except the lobbyists and the politicians who are cutting those deals in the first place. I think Colorado has a lot to teach Washington about how to make the legislative process more accountable and more transparent.
Folks, it's always a pleasure to advertise for The New Yorker. It's considered by many to be the most influential magazine in the world. It's renowned for its in-depth reporting, political, cultural commentary, fiction, poetry, humor, Many of the guests that we've had on this program have written in the New Yorker, are on because of about a piece in the New Yorker. It's a guaranteed. There's never a time I've ever picked up the magazine and haven't read something that made me think, that was interesting. They've got a piece that about slavery reenactments that was in, one that looks back on what happened with Warren's campaign, things like there was a great piece on baseball this past week, stealing signs, I think it was about. The New Yorker, regardless of what you are into, you can look at it as a website or as an app or the print magazine. If you're interested in food, if you're interested in politics, as I am, crossword puzzles, the New Yorker's exceptional writers make them unique. You got Robin Wright, who covers politics and international affairs. She won multiple awards for her writing, including a National Magazine Award for the first piece she ever wrote for The New Yorker in 1988. Hilton Als, who won the Pulitzer Prize for criticism in 2017. Now you can get 12 weeks for just $6. That's half the regular cost, plus a New Yorker tote bag. You'll get home delivery of the print edition each week, plus unlimited access to NewYorker.com. That also includes app access, online archives dating back to 1925, just a year or two before I was born. Crossword puzzles and more. Get 12 weeks of the New Yorker for just $6. You didn't even say anything, Matt. You didn't even blink at that. You weren't even listening. I was not born in 1925. Plus an exclusive tote at NewYorker.com/majority. Go to NewYorker.com/majority. Honestly, my parents are impressed that this show is referenced relative to that publication. NewYorker.com/majority. You'll save 50% when you enter the code majority at checkout. And also, folks, we're still just not even 60 days out from New Year's. You've all made your resolutions. You want to get fit in 2020? You don't have to join a gym. You don't have to pay a ton for overpriced exercise equipment. The best way to get in the greatest shape of your life is with Echelon. Go to echelonfit.com and discover the EX connected fitness bikes. It's all the rage now. What do they call that? Spinning or something. That offer a high-quality, at-home cycling experience at less than half the price of a Peloton. Echelon makes beautifully engineered products for everyone. Busy moms, busy dads, first responders, elite athletes, whatever your activity level is, this is for you. And with daily live and on-demand studio classes right in your home, you never have to step foot in a gym. Those things in New York cost an enormous amount of money. I was shocked. You're going to love Echelon. And you'll also be joining the hundreds of thousands of men and women who are getting fit with their bikes in on-demand studio classes already. If you aren't 100% satisfied, they'll give you your money back. You don't have to pay a ton for a Peloton. Sorry. It's just...
shouldn't be giving away stuff like that for free.
I know. Buy an Echelon bike today for under $1,000. That's like, in this city, that's like 6 months of going to one of those classes there. Go to echelonfit.com/Sam to learn about their limited time free Apple iPad. That's nuts. And complete details of this exclusive offer. It's Echelon. It's your time. That's Echelon, ECHELON, fit.com/Sam. Echelonfit.com/Sam. All right, now back to our interview with Romanoff, and then we'll follow it up with my interview with Stuart Schrader on Badges Without Borders, how global counterinsurgency transformed American policing.
As you've mentioned, that climate change, obviously a huge priority for you, and obviously the clock is ticking, and certainly from Colorado. I mean, there really is few places in the country, I think, where we don't begin to see the implications of this. But of course, we're seeing it all around the world. You also have, as one of your priorities listed on AndrewRomanoff.com, is ensuring health care for all. Where are you in the spectrum of the various plans that we hear, particularly in the context of the presidential election? What plan do you support? Is there legislation that's been introduced in either body that you support at this point? What is your theory of the case?
Yes, I support Medicare for all, and I'll tell you what I mean and why. One, I think we ought to strengthen Medicare by adding some benefits that aren't covered now, like dental and vision and hearing and long-term care. And two, I think we ought to lower the age of Medicare eligibility to 0, which was part of the proponents' original plan. If you go back to 1965, when LBJ signed Medicare and Medicaid into law, the idea then wasn't that you would stop with seniors, giving them the security of health care that can never be taken away, although I'm glad we got there. It was instead to extend that same protection to all Americans. I support this plan in part, Sam, because of the experience I've had battling the insurance industry. I spent 4 years as the president of Mental Health Colorado, the state's leading advocate on behalf of families, frankly, like mine, who have suffered from mental illness or drug addiction or experienced suicide. And I'll tell you one quick story. I know it's easy to get lost in a conversation about the 28 million Americans who are uninsured, or the 44 million who are underinsured, or the 500,000 families who go bankrupt each year because they can't afford their medical bills. I met a dad whose son had deep depression and then experienced a bout of psychosis. He needed treatment. His dad's insurance plan was supposed to cover it. Most plans, in fact, by law, are required to provide equal coverage for mental and physical care. But when the dad submitted a claim, the insurance company said no. So the dad appealed the decision, and the company said no. This went on for months until his son killed himself at the age of 14. 3 weeks later, his dad got a letter in the mail from the insurance company reversing its decision and agreeing to cover his late son's treatment. So I will just tell you, Sam, speaking not as a candidate, but as a human being, it is really painful for me to have conversations with moms and dads who have lost their kids, not just to a disease that we can treat, but also to the indifference of an industry that bases its profits on its ability to exclude as many sick people and deny as many claims as possible. That's the business model. And it's a great model if you're an insurance company. It's a pretty lousy model for the rest of us.
And what's your sense of the ability, like how rapidly we could move to a system like that?
I think reasonable people can differ on how quickly we can get there, but we got to put the plan on the table. That's the point. It wasn't on the table, as you know, when the debate over the Affordable Care Act began 10 years ago. Even the public option, which was advanced fairly timidly, got sacrificed in those negotiations. You shouldn't begin the negotiations at the 50-yard line. That's one of the lessons I take from my experience as Speaker of the House. So you're never going to get this plan if you don't actually put it out there. And I think we can get from here to there in part by recognizing that what we're doing now doesn't work. I mean, healthcare costs are the single biggest source of bankruptcy in the United States. We're seeing something like 35,000 people in this nation die each year because they can't afford to see a doctor or a healthcare provider. And we're spending, as you know, twice as much as our competitors on healthcare that's not actually twice as good. Our life expectancy isn't longer. Our infant or maternal mortality rates aren't lower. We're just leading the world in spending. And we're going.
So how do you respond to Hickenlooper, who, if you face in the general, will claim that you're going to outlaw private health insurance for folks? What's the response for that?
Well, I'd say a few things. I have not met a lot of families in Colorado who tell me, please don't touch my Anthem or my United or my Cigna. Folks say, please make sure that my doctor or my specialist is covered, and all of them would be, right, under a plan of Medicare for all those providers would be participating in the system. I have met some folks who said they liked their insurance until they had to use it, and then they figured out it didn't actually cover what they thought. And I've met plenty of folks who can't wait to turn 65 so that they can get the security that comes from Medicare. On the flip side, I've met young people who just aged out of their parents' plans when they turned 26. Nobody in their right mind would design a system like this from scratch. It's not really a system at all. It's just a patchwork, a crazy quilt that we've assembled. And we're going to need to take on the insurance industry and the drug companies if we want to extend coverage and improve quality and hold down costs, which is the goal of healthcare reform.
So you are a longtime educator. Let's talk a little bit about public education. I can see from your priorities on your website at andrewromanoff.com that you want to guarantee essentially universal pre-K and full-day kindergarten. Talk about that briefly, and then let's talk about the other end of the educational, I guess, journey, higher education.
Sure. I've met enough elementary school teachers and parents who can tell you that the kids who get the advantage of high-quality early childhood education are more likely to do well in school and less likely to fall behind or drop out. So the advantage of high-quality preschool and full-day kindergarten are obvious and monumental. It's one of the reasons that Governor Polis and the legislature here in Colorado are taking steps in that direction. I think it's a guarantee we ought to extend to all Americans. And it's one of the reasons I fought so hard when I was in the state legislature to increase funding, not just for early childhood education, but for our schools generally, where funding lags the nation. I teamed up with a friend here who was the state treasurer at the time, a woman named Carrie Kennedy, to author the largest investment in school construction in state history. I worked on legislation to improve access to higher education. And I want to make sure that teachers actually get paid what they're worth, because we're losing a lot of good people to that profession because we have shortchanged it or blame them for everything that society itself fails to address.
So what does that mean in terms of like tangible plans for higher ed?
So the plan I believe we ought to extend says let's relieve students of that $1.5 trillion of debt they're carrying now, more than credit card debt, more than car loans. It's a huge drag on the economy and the productivity of the country, and obviously on the ability of a young person or even a not so young person who's still saddled under that debt to find a job and buy a home and save enough for retirement. And I think just as we made a commitment in this country that a free education would be available through 12th grade, we need to recognize that a high school diploma is not enough to train someone for the sorts of jobs that the economy is now creating. It doesn't have to be a 4-year degree because not everybody wants one or gets one or needs one, but it's got to be some kind of post-secondary training. We've been talking to a lot of folks about apprenticeship programs, about community colleges like those in Colorado where I've taught, and about 4-year institutions or beyond. I think we can make that commitment as a country. Several pieces of legislation in Congress that would do it. Obviously, the feds can't pick up the whole tab, and so most of the bills I've seen allow for a state share as well. And to be honest, Colorado needs to do a better job. We fell to something like 49th in the nation in public support for higher education and lost good jobs to other states that more effectively made that investment.
We just have a minute left. I think, the importance of having a progressive senator fill one of the seats that hopefully will be taken from a Republican is huge for progressives across the country. What do you need to win at the very least in the primary, and then of course we'll see in the general?
We need the resources to win. We're being outspent heavily by not just Cory Gardner's campaign, but by the Schumer gang in D.C. that's bankrolling the opposition. Folks can contribute at andrewromanoff.com. Our polling shows if we win the nomination, we'll win the whole thing. And if we raise enough money to get on TV, we'll win the nomination, because the agenda we're laying out on a lot of the progressive priorities that you've been kind enough to let me describe here, Sam, the Coloradans side with us. They want somebody who will bring not just a set of legislative skills, but also a sense of urgency to the Senate, and who will fight as if our lives depended on it, because they do.
Andrew Romanoff, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program the Associate Director of the Program for Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship at Johns Hopkins University, and author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. Stuart Schrader, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So your book is fascinating, and it
It sort of reminded me a little bit, if I could just start off with a complete non sequitur tangent. I used to be a TV and film director, and one of the things that I would do is look at a script, pull out certain themes, and then reapply it to every other scene, to every scene in the book. And on some level, you describe here a phenomena where what started as something that we exported was then brought back to this country in the form of policing. And let's start where this happens over the course of or at least your book recounts it over the course of a 30-year period. Let's start with I guess it starts with the OPS largely, and this program to professionalize police around the world. What was the impetus for that?
Yeah, the impetus behind OPS, the Office of Public Safety, was to upgrade and enhance the capabilities of police around the globe, primarily in what we would call, or what were called at the time, third world countries. The United States offered this type of assistance to about 52 countries, and the Office of Public Safety officially got its start under the Kennedy administration in the early 1960s, but some of this work had been already ongoing going back into the 50s using some of the same personnel. And the idea was that the Cold War meant there were many countries around the globe that were at risk of becoming communist countries, becoming allied with the Soviet Union or China, and after the Cuban Revolution with Cuba. And U.S. national security officials believed that the best way to prevent those countries from undergoing a communist revolution was to bolster their internal security resources. They use the phrase internal security a lot. And those resources, of course, to some degree consisted of military resources, but also to a large degree consisted of police resources. And the thinking of the police experts who staffed the Office of Public Safety was that using basically everyday policing techniques that were used in the United States would be the best way to bolster the police capabilities of these countries around the globe. And so, as I show in the book, in Badges Without Borders, I show that the people who staffed the Office of Public Safety were largely well-experienced veterans of policing in the United States who traveled abroad and brought with them their ideas that they had honed in their own law enforcement careers here. But they also confronted many somewhat different experiences and situations overseas. And then when they came back to the United States, they brought some of that knowledge that they had gained overseas back to the United States. And they also, importantly, brought with them technological innovations that they had developed for overseas use.
So what was so we have this sort of like the tactical expertise and sort of the broad, the narrow strategic agenda of people that we sent to these countries. But there were sensitivities, right? Well, you just described that sort of dynamic where we wanted to impose, put a lid on stuff, but not make it look like we were putting a lid on stuff, I guess.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that's one of the reasons that I focus on police itself. Of course, the United States did use its military power around the globe during the post-World War II period. And as we know, Korea and Vietnam are the most glaring examples until you get to the Reagan years. But that's two places. there were many, many other places around the globe that the United States was keeping an eye on, that intelligence reports funneled all the way up to the president's desk suggested that the risk of communist subversion was real and was growing. And there was a sense among national security experts, intelligence experts, that if the United States were to deploy its military to these places, a massive backlash would ensue. And it would cause the very problem it was trying to prevent, which was the overthrow of the government or the destabilization of the regime, and the enhancement of anti-American sentiment. So instead of invading countries militarily, the United States gave this police assistance to these countries. And this was generally overt. There would be stories about it in local newspapers. The United States would try to make sure those stories got printed to kind of indicate the good and generous support that the U.S. was giving to the local police. And the governments signed contracts with the United States where basically there was an agreement that went both ways, saying, yes, we want you to come bring your police expertise to us. We welcome it. Now, when we talk about a bilateral contract, signed between diplomats from the United States and a country in the third world, of course we can't assume that there was an equal footing. The U.S. had a preponderance of geopolitical and economic power, so those agreements were not exactly equal agreements. But nonetheless, the United States was trying not to be seen as imposing its will in these countries, and the police assistance program was a way to, as you said, impose its will without seeming to be doing that.
I mean, I'm sort of flooded with various questions about that, because the implications of that are pretty stunning, right? Like the idea that, inherently, if we as the United States come into a foreign country and are training the police, right, there's already a certain amount of suspicion that one would assume is there in terms of us trying to impose our will, right, on a country and create sort of like a mechanism in which to tamp down social disorder, which was the actual agenda. So the idea that maybe the police does that in this country, right, like where it sort of, that's sort of the point of the book on some level. But all right, so let me just ask this, because to what extent did the strategy, how much of that strategy existed, do you think, in this country prior to that time, before it comes back, where the sort of tactics are updated and perhaps maybe the philosophies are slightly updated, downgraded depending on your perspective? I mean, I'm thinking now of, Chris Hayes has a book of A Colony Within a Nation, which talks about the idea of policing, at least for, significant portions of our population, has been about control, as opposed to maybe other parts of the population where police has been more about like protect and serve. How much of that philosophy was in existence prior to these folks being sent abroad to apply that philosophy in places where we perceived there being a chance of social unrest and the danger of communism? Right.
I think that mid-century policing experts were, on their own terms, caught in an irresolvable contradiction. On the one hand, they were resolutely opposed to communism. They were certainly not on the side of labor. Many police leaders throughout the country went through a training program overseen by J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. Their politics were conservative. They were oftentimes bigoted, oftentimes in their local settings, police were there to enforce the color line. On the other hand, a lot of the police experts also believed that policing was a profession that should be taken seriously, accorded a certain level of social esteem and prestige, and that could be informed by scientific methods and required a certain kind of technical expertise and sensibility. And so those two ideas or kind of driving forces for policing experts, the way that they made them work together was best displayed, in my view, in the work that they did overseas, where they got to apply their technical mastery and their ideas about police as a distinctive profession to the vociferous fight against communism. Domestically, of course, during the Cold War was no question that fighting communism was, essential. But on the other hand, the communist movement in the United States, in part because of longstanding repression going back to the 1920s, was not nearly as big as it was in many of the countries around the globe where the United States gave police assistance. So for that reason, enforcing the color line probably was the main task of many police as far as they understood their job. But police experts, police leaders knew that enforcement of the color line oftentimes just led to discrediting of the police. And so it really contradicted their notion that police should be accorded a certain amount of respect and social prestige. And the most kind of obvious example of this was during the early civil rights movement, when there was nationally broadcast scenes of just vicious police violence against peaceful civil rights protesters. Police experts around the country knew that this was really bad for the profession as a whole. And even if they may have agreed with the idea that civil rights protests should have been repressed and it was necessary to clamp down on it, they were not happy about the kind of public relations disaster that ensued.
What did it look like in these countries in terms of, because this is tied into your notion of U.S. imperialism. Mm-hmm. And what did it look like in terms of like what they were going to do? If to juxtapose it with this idea of like, to maintain our perspective on police as being sort of, neutral arbiters and having a professional code and it not being dictated by racism, let's say, and, I guess Bull Connor makes us look bad because he's not being professional about this. Like, what was the practice
right
that they used in these foreign countries?
Sure. So the assistance program consisted of basically three main categories. The first was technical assistance, where, and of course, in many forms of developmental aid, technical assistance is central. What that means is that a U.S. expert shows up and says, I'm going to show you the best way to accomplish a given task. When it came to policing, that would mean showing an aid recipient police force how to, say, organize their fingerprint files. And they would, of course, the United States would also provide the materials for fingerprint files. So that's another category, is providing materials. Now, that was the most expensive category because a lot of the materials, were not so cheap and small as a fingerprint kit. Of course, they were automobiles, motorcycles, guns, ammunition, and so forth. And then the third category was training, because, of course, once you have a fingerprint database system, once you have the actual materials for it, you need to train cops in how to, take fingerprints and so on and so forth. Training typically happened at a higher level. It wasn't ranked the lowest ranks. It was more middle ranks of officers, with the idea that when the United States trained the middle rank officers, they would, or even the highest rank, they would then go back to their home countries and train their own officers in the way that they had been trained in the United States. And so the United States operated a police academy in Washington, D.C. called the International Police Academy from the early 1960s into the middle of the 1970s. And approximately 10,000 police from other countries attended the International Police Academy. And many of them went on to lead various forces in their home countries, whether it would be, the equivalent of a state police force, all the way up to being the kind of top level official, the equivalent of J. Edgar Hoover in the home country.
And so they do this, and the idea is that they're going to have the capacity. I mean, is the idea that they're just going to stop nascent like insurgencies, or is the idea that they're going to stop? Yes. Okay, so like, how does that? Do these police forces, like, how do they do that? I mean,
how do they do that?
Well, like, I mean, are they like, is it like, is it Elite Force? Like, that movie, those movies,
right.
Like, are they going in?
Right.
I mean, how?
Yeah,
or does it just happen?
It's a good question, and I think that in some ways it's a little bit hard to visualize because we have a kind of Hollywood vision of what it takes.
Right.
But the argument of the officials I look at in Badges Without Borders was that it just required good old-fashioned police work. Now, that's not to say that there weren't specialized forces. There certainly were, and the United States helped to create highly trained and highly skilled, more specialized forces, akin to, on the one hand, the kind of Red Squad that we know from U.S. history, or on the other hand, to what today we might call a SWAT team. But generally, the idea was that the best way to make sure that there was not an infiltrating band of subversives who might be riling up the population was to engage in regular police work. So, of course, one of the ideas that is a premise underneath all of this is that subversives typically came from outside and came into a country, and they were not native to a given country. They were sent by Moscow or wherever. So what that meant was you needed police who could control a border. You needed police who could do customs inspections. Customs inspections would turn up everything from illegally trafficked guns and ammunition to, pamphlets of subversive propaganda. You needed to be able to effect car searches. You needed to be able to engage in stop and frisk. You needed to be able to check IDs. And in countries where there was not already a national ID system, the Office of Public Safety helped to introduce national ID cards or various other types of identification systems. And the idea behind that was, how are you going to know who the population is and whether somebody is, where they're supposed to be, is telling you the truth about where they work, what their business is, and so on? How will you ever be able to know if you don't have a kind of baseline set of data and an implement to check against?
Did they introduce like driver's licenses and stuff like that?
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, many of the, of course, a driver's license is such a very pedestrian technology. We all have them and we don't think much about it. But, a driver's license has to be tamper-proof. It has to be somewhat durable. So the technologies that companies came up with to develop tamper-proof, durable cards that everybody could carry, many of those companies had a lot of their technological innovations start in the 1960s through the Office of Public Safety programs contracts. So creating a durable tamper-proof ID card for Southam helped companies in the United States to develop the exact same thing for use in the United States.
I met a guy at a college reunion a couple of years back. I didn't particularly ever like him, but he was like bragging to me that he was working with like some type of security firm that was going over to. He didn't tell me exactly, but I got the sense it was like some type of repressive regime in the Middle East. I'm like, we're doing facial technology, and I'm like, oh, that's horrible. And I mean, that's the way it works, right? Like, we go, we develop the technology there, and it's just a matter of time before it comes back to the United States. I mean, I probably should have had you tell this story up front, because this, in many respects, I think captures it more than anything else. But 911, will you outline what, we all think like this is great,
Sure.
911, but it's a little creepier when you start to hear how it was developed, and it gives you a sense of like what the foundations are for it. I'm not sure exactly how you would express it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Foundations is the right term. Part of what I'm trying to show in Badges Without Borders again is that yes, many of these very everyday, normal aspects of law enforcement that we probably tend to take for granted have, if not distinctive origins, they have at least partial origins in testing in the of overseas counterinsurgency. So the 911 emergency call number is an example. It was first the idea of introducing a single number that everybody could call and would get through to a unified kind of emergency services switchboard was introduced in Venezuela. And of course, this is sometimes, given contemporary U.S.-Venezuela relations, seems a little funny, but the United States gave a great deal of security assistance to Venezuela in the 1960s, and that was one of the places where the number was tested. And some U.S. policing experts, law enforcement experts, were really opposed to the idea of a single number that everybody could call. And, there were various bureaucratic reasons for their skepticism that it would be a good idea. But after this idea was tested in Venezuela and seemed to be kind of effective, and the reason that Venezuela was the kind of test case for it was that it was in the midst of a pretty intense and apparently violent insurgency going on with kidnapping, shootings, sabotage, bombings, and so forth by apparent left-wing guerrillas. And the idea was, well, the guerrillas, they shoot somebody or they kidnap somebody and then they get away before any bystander can notify the police. So if we if we put into place this emergency number, witnesses, bystanders will be able to call the police, and therefore they will apprehend the guerrillas more quickly. So once it happened that it was instituted in Venezuela, some of the advisors from the Office of Public Safety who were instrumental in that implementation came back to the United States and talked to their law enforcement counterparts in the United States, and ultimately the recommendation came through. It was already something that people were talking about in law enforcement circles, but some of the skepticism about whether it would work was alleviated based on the examples that they brought back with them from Venezuela. And then, toward the end of the 1960s into the early 1970s, the single emergency number started to become really widely adopted. And the idea was that having a 3-digit number that everybody could remember was the best way. And now, of course, every so often there will be a news story about a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who calls 911 because they've learned it and it's easy to memorize. Nobody in those news stories says, well, it has its origins in urban counterinsurgency during the Cold War in Venezuela.
So this is ultimately, I think, what the book is about, and we have, and you break it down into sort of like there are 3, I guess, characters that capture this. Maybe let me ask you that first before we get to that sort of like broader implications of something as, like you say, pedestrian and ubiquitous as 911. Like, what are the implications that it comes from its origins? But there are 3 major characters who sort of like I guess are the tent poles of the processes here.
Right.
Byron Engel, and who was of the OPS, and Sagolin, Arnold Sagolin, who ended up coming back to, who was also, I think, involved in that as well, and then Robert Comer, who developed chords. Tell just briefly, just so we have a little bit of a notion, what those 3 guys, what they represent in the context, or what work they're doing for you in this story, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. So Badges Without Borders focuses on a whole bunch of individuals, but the main 3 are, as you said, Byron Engel, Robert Comer, and Arnold Sagolin. Byron Engel was the director of the Office of Public Safety. He is the most important figure for the Overseas Police Assistance Program. He gets his start in policing in Kansas City at the end of the 1930s, and he's kind of a policing phenom, a boy wonder of police training. And he then, at the end of World War II, goes abroad to Japan during the occupation of Japan. After the end of World War II, he's one of the key figures overseeing the reconfiguration of the police force there. And basically from that point on until the about the middle of the 1970s, he's traveling around the globe working on various programs of the United States to upgrade the policing capabilities of other countries. And he has affiliations with the CIA during the 1950s. And he's kind of the most consistent figure throughout this history that I follow. Robert Comer is a National Security Council figure. He became relatively well known in the United States during the war in Vietnam because Lyndon Johnson appointed him as the person to kind of be in charge of the counterinsurgency program in South Vietnam that went by the name CORDS, CORDS. But Comer, before that, before the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, he had been with the CIA. When he comes into the Kennedy administration, he is one of the people tasked with figuring out how to stem the tide of communist insurgency in the Third World. And through his CIA background, he knows about what Byron Engel has been already doing, and he is quite insistent that using police to prevent communist revolution is the best way to go, as I already indicated. And he is instrumental in helping create the Office of Public Safety and to give it a sort of firm bureaucratic station, which basically means a strong budget line. And he and Engel continue to work together until the end of Comer's career with the Johnson administration, which is basically when he's kind of forced out of South Vietnam for giving these kind of rosy reports about how well things are going when it's quite clear that everything is going terribly. But Comer had a career after that. He continues in the national security world into the 70s and beyond. And then, the third figure is Arnold Sagol, who was he had been a journalist. He had some connections with law enforcement, and he got hired during the Kennedy administration by the Department of the Treasury, which we don't tend to think of in terms of law enforcement, but especially at that time, there were a number of agencies that were law enforcement agencies that were housed in the Treasury Department, and still to this day, the Secret Service, for example, is. And
he also worked with Elliot Ness too, didn't he?
Yeah. When he was quite young, he got to know Elliot Ness, and that was sort of how he got his start in law enforcement. And Elliot Ness was famous for kind of being the top cop during Prohibition, I guess. Right. So Sagol, in his position in the Treasury Department, he sort of oversaw coordination and training among various law enforcement agencies in the Treasury Department, and then he became the U.S. representative to Interpol, thanks to the work of Byron Engel kind of behind the scenes. So Engel and Sagol developed a close relationship beginning in the Kennedy administration. And then Sagol really had a reputation in Washington for being quite knowledgeable about law enforcement, for having relatively progressive politics. And so he was trusted by police and trusted by liberals in the Kennedy and Johnson administration, which meant that when it came time for the Johnson administration to make serious moves about reorienting law enforcement nationally, it called upon Sagol. And Sagol came to the Johnson administration and said, look, what law enforcement needs in the United States is technical assistance, just like what the Office of Public Safety is giving to law enforcement in the Third World. And he brought Byron Engel into the halls of power that were concerned with domestic issues, and used the example of the Office of Public Safety.
And this is an Engel, as opposed to the Engel from a couple of years earlier, who has now sort of been stewing in he has now learned tactics and a perspective that has marinated in a much more adversarial, I guess, right? I guess situation, right? Like, he's bringing back this stuff from where the police forces are, if not explicitly, implicitly counterinsurgencies.
That's exactly right. Yeah. When he was a police officer in Kansas City, there was no communist insurgency. When he was overseeing the reform of the Japanese police in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there was no communist insurgency. Although there was a communist movement in Japan that he was there to suppress. But yeah, by the time you get to the late 1960s, he has been overseeing relationships between the United States national security agencies and police forces around the globe where there are actual ongoing insurgencies, from South Vietnam to countries in Africa to Latin America. So yeah, he has now experienced a great deal of political instability and unrest, and he has been overseeing the efforts of police to, if not prevent, then to stamp out these types of unrest. So yeah, I take the implication of your question to be, well, how does he look at the United States in the 1960s? What is his take on the rebellions of the 1960s? And his take on the rebellions of the 1960s is, yeah, look, the way to deal with these problems is the same way we deal with analogous problems in the third world. Interestingly, what he says and what Sagolin helps to disseminate this message from him is that police in the United States from 1960 to 67, in situations of political unrest in black neighborhoods, police have been vicious, and this has backfired, and it has discredited police, it has worsened unrest, and contributed to greater violence. So what Engel says is, instead of being so wantonly violent by, say, for example, shooting guns wildly into crowds, as happened in, Harlem, Detroit, Newark, and so forth, police should use non-lethal, quote-unquote, non-lethal technologies, as the Office of Public Safety has been recommending in third world countries. Chief among them is so-called tear gas, the chemical called CS, which is a really strong, very potent type of chemical irritant. So starting in 1968, after Sagolin and Engel together start making these recommendations, the United States military and police around the country, in situations of quote unquote civil disturbances, they start using CS in great quantities.
And to some degree, we're talking about a situation. He's sent overseas and he comes back a hammer, and so everything's a nail on some level, right? I mean, there's that quality of that's operating. So let me ask you this: with Engel, who is sort of like the manifestation of like the journey of 911 on some respects. We're in a situation where we have millions of people who are in jail or in prison. We have millions more who are in some ways like involved in our carceral state. Like, how much of that is? I mean, maybe this is too specific of a question, but I guess I just want you to address like that sort of like that idea of, how much of that counterinsurgency, I guess, how much of counterinsurgency is in the DNA of what we have in policing today? And because we don't necessarily have, and how much of that as applied to a place where we don't really have a counterinsurgency, right? Like when tools to deal with a counterinsurgency get applied to people who are not counterinsurgents.
Not insurgents.
Right, not insurgents, rather, I should say. Is that why we have, is that part of it? And, I know obviously another part of it is there's a lot of profit to be made here, for people. But is that in your mind, or is that, or at the very least, that's something that we should be considering?
Yes, definitely. So I would say two main points on this. The first is that I think it's important to understand that counterinsurgency theory and counterinsurgency practice suggest that you don't apply it only to quote unquote insurgents. You apply it to the entire population. because the thing about counterinsurgency is that what it's trying to do is prevent people who are not politically committed or whose views are malleable to become sort of swayed or convinced to go to the side of the insurgency. There's going to be, under the premise of counterinsurgency, is that there's going to be a certain number of people who are, diehard insurgents. There's a certain number of people who can be counted on to be loyal, but the vast majority of the population can be swayed one way or the other. So you apply counterinsurgency techniques to the entire population. Some of that means applying harsh security measures, but some of that means affording them various forms of developmental or welfare increasing practices. In third world countries, that would mean introducing irrigation to help with crop yields. Very, very basic things. These are part of the idea behind counterinsurgency, because, well, if people's crop yields are better and they're less likely to be really hungry, well, then they won't listen to the appeals of the communist propaganda that says if you're hungry, it's because of the capitalist power structure, so on and so forth. So that's one part of it. And the way that we can make a connection is to say that there is a generalized application of a lot of security practices in the United States that is at the core of the carceral state. On the other hand, I think a more specific linkage is that the period that I look at in the 1960s is a period when police learn how to make an argument on their own behalf in a kind of coherent and cogent way that says, if there are social problems, we can solve them. And the best way to make sure that we're able to solve them is to endow us with a great amount of resources. The Johnson administration was basically convinced by this argument and launched the war on crime. And what the war on crime did was funnel resources from Washington to states and municipalities to bolster policing capabilities. And, each major federal piece of federal legislation concerned with crime that has come through under Reagan, under Clinton, they have all given a great amount of money and other types of resources to police. So figures in my analysis, figures like Sagol, Engel, and others are crucial to developing this kind of argument on behalf of police that says, give us the resources and we will solve the matter at hand. Now, there's a certain kind of almost blackmail involved, which is that it's like if the problem doesn't get solved, well, clearly you just didn't give enough resources, right? So if crime hasn't gone away, if there's still political unrest, so on and so on and so on, well, just keep throwing more resources at police. And I think that this way of thinking remains dominant to this day. And if anything, police in 2020 are even more adept at making this argument. They were not they came into it tentatively in the 1960s, and in 2020 it's kind of an article of faith.
It's fascinating stuff. The Badges Without Borders: How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing. Stuart Schrader. We will put a link to Badges Without Borders at our website at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.